The sun in July 1974 didn't just shine over Harlan County, it punished it. The sky was a pale, merciless blue, stripped of every cloud, looking like a piece of hot tin that had been beaten flat by a hammer. Down on the ground, the earth was screaming. The south field, 63 acres of soybeans that should have been a lush, vibrant sea of green, was instead a graveyard of parched dirt. The soil had cracked into jagged puzzle pieces, the fissures deep enough to swallow a man's hand, reaching down into the darkness as if searching for a moisture that simply wasn't there anymore. Earl Cutler stood at the fence line that separated his modest 63 acres from the sprawling 400 acres owned by Raymond Hollis. Earl was 61 years old, a man whose skin had been cured by 38 years of Kentucky seasons until it looked like the leather of a well-worn saddle. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the cedar fence post, feeling the heat radiate off the wood. He was watching his soybeans. They were 9 weeks from harvest, but they were already dying. The leaves, once wide and hopeful, had begun to curl inward, turning a sickly, pale shade of olive, a desperate attempt to shield themselves from a sun that intended to burn them to dust. Then, the silence of the afternoon was shattered by the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine 1974 fire-engine red Chevrolet pickup, still smelling of the dealership floor and gleaming with a wax job that felt like an insult in this dust, pulled right up to the property line. It didn't slow down, it skidded to a halt, kicking up a plume of fine, gray silt that settled over Earl's boots. Raymond Hollis climbed out. Raymond was a man of abundance of land, abundance of equipment, and an abundance of ego. He stood with one heavy work boot planted firmly on his chrome bumper, his thumbs hooked into a silver-buckled belt, and he looked across the fence at Earl's dying crop. He didn't just smile, he laughed. It was a loud, jagged sound that echoed across the dry valley, intended to make sure anyone within a mile knew exactly who was winning the war against the weather. "Well, Earl," Raymond shouted, his voice dripping with a cruel kind of satisfaction, "looks like God himself has given up on you." Earl Cutler said nothing. He didn't defend himself, and he didn't look away. He absorbed the laughter the way the dry earth absorbed the heat, quietly and without a choice. But inside, he felt the weight of a reality that Raymond couldn't possibly understand. Earl's well had run dry 4 days ago. It hadn't been a slow decline, it had happened with the suddenness of a heart stopping. One morning the pump was giving clear, cold water, and the next, it was pulling nothing but hot, dusty air. Just 24 hours earlier, Earl had swallowed his pride and walked across to the Hollis mansion. He had asked Raymond, quietly, honestly, and without any performance, if he could purchase water access from one of Hollis's 3 deep wells. He didn't ask for a handout. He offered to pay a fair price, a premium price, whatever Raymond thought was right, just enough to keep the soybeans alive for another 3 weeks. Raymond had smiled then, too. "Earl, I've got my own operation to think about," he had said, even as his automatic sprinklers were turning his lawn into an emerald oasis. "I can't be running water lines to every dry farm in the county." Now, standing at the fence, Raymond was driving the point home. He looked at the cracked earth and the curling leaves and saw a man who was finished. To Raymond, Earl was a relic, a 61-year-old widower with a son working a mill job in Evansville, a man with exactly $1,200 in the bank and a mortgage that still had 9 years of life left in it. If this crop failed, the farm failed. There was no recovery at 61. There was no second act. The county extension man had already been out. He had walked the property with a measuring tape and a grim expression, checking the 1951 well casing. His verdict had been a death sentence. "The water table has dropped, Earl. You're at 80 feet, and the water is gone. You'd need to go down another 60, maybe 80 feet to find the new level. That's $1,200 minimum for the drilling alone, and there's no guarantee what you'd hit." $1,200. Every cent Earl had to his name. Neighbors had tried to help, but their kindness couldn't overcome the physics of the drought. Gerald Atkins had offered his pond water, but the pond was a stagnant pool of green algae and silt that would have choked Earl's irrigation pipes in an hour. Walt Petton at the co-op had called a water hauling service, but at $250 a load, Earl would have needed $900 a week just to keep the plants from turning to ash. The math was a closed door, and the key was buried somewhere deep underground. Raymond Hollis watched Earl's silence and mistook it for defeat. He climbed back into his red truck, the engine roaring with a power that mocked Earl's broken pump, and sped away, leaving another cloud of dust to settle on the dying south field. Earl turned and walked back toward his farmhouse. He walked slowly, his boots crunching on the dead grass. He didn't go to the bank, and he didn't call a realtor. Instead, he went into the kitchen, sat down at the worn oak table, and looked at a photograph of his father, George Cutler, taken in 1930. In that photograph, George was standing in a field that looked exactly like the one Earl had just left, cracked, dry, and desperate. 1930 had been the great drought, the one that broke 1,000 men in Harlan County. But George Cutler hadn't broken. He had stood in that dust and told his 17-year-old son a truth that Earl was only now beginning to truly hear. "Earl," his father had said, his palms pressed flat against the parched earth, "the water doesn't disappear. It just goes somewhere else. Your job is to figure out where it went." As the sun began to dip behind the ridge, casting long orange shadows across the kitchen floor, Earl felt something settle inside him. It wasn't hope, it was memory. He remembered the spring mornings he had spent for 44 years walking his western fence line, pressing his own boots into the soil at a particular bend in the dry creek bed. He remembered the way the frost lingered there longer than anywhere else in March. He remembered the way the soil stayed dark after a rain, as if something deep below was reaching up to hold onto the moisture. Raymond Hollis thought the story was over because the well was dry. But Earl Cutler knew that the ground held secrets that no red truck or bank account could ever buy. He knew that beneath the cracked gray earth of the south field, there was an ancient geometry of gravel and stone, a hidden channel that had been moving water for 1,000 years. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Denton brothers, the best well drillers in the state. He was about to bet every dollar he owned, his entire farm, and his remaining years on a 91-foot ghost that only he and his dead father could see. On the morning of July 26, 1974, the Denton brothers arrived at the Cutler farm in a vehicle that looked as though it had been forged in the same era as the land itself. It was a 1966 International truck, carrying a heavy, loud, and methodical cable tool drilling rig that seemed to vibrate the very air. Phil Denton, a man who had spent his life driving steel into the earth to find what was hidden, climbed out and wiped the dust from his eyes. He didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the property, his boots kicking up clouds of fine Kentucky silt that had no weight and no moisture. When Phil reached the spot Earl had marked, a subtle northward curve in the old dry creek bed, 400 feet away from the barn and the existing plumbing, he stopped. He looked at the barn, then back at the creek bed, his brow furrowed in professional skepticism. "Most people drill closer to the barn, Earl," Phil said, his voice flat with the logic of a man who prefers short pipes and easy access. "It saves a lot of trenching and a lot of wire." Earl stood his ground, his shadow long and thin against the parched earth. "My father drilled here in 1930, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 44 years of memory. "Different well, but the same water. He taught me what's underneath this spot, and I've been checking it every spring for 20 years. I know what's down there." Phil Denton studied Earl for a long moment, looking for a sign of heat stroke or desperation. Finding none, he crouched and pressed his own hand against the earth. He wasn't doing it with the ancestral focus of Earl's father, but with the professional instinct of a man who had drilled 1,000 wells and learned to feel the topography of the deep geology. He looked at the way the land narrowed at the bend, the way the soil held a fractional darkness even in this heat, and the ancient geometry that George Cutler had identified decades ago. Phil stood up, adjusted his cap, and gave a single sharp nod. "All right," he said. The setup took 2 hours. The cable tool rig began its work, not with a high-speed scream of a modern rotary drill, but with a slow, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of steel driving into the ground, one careful blow at a time. To the neighbors who gathered at the fence line, it was a sound of absolute madness. They stood there, the dust settling in their hair, watching the Denton brothers waste time and Earl's final $1,200 on a spot that made no sense to their modern eyes. Raymond Hollis drove past on the county road in the late afternoon of the first day, his red Chevrolet slowing to a crawl. He didn't get out. He just leaned his elbow on the window frame and looked at the rig sitting 400 feet from the barn, a solitary island of iron in a sea of dying soybeans. He didn't need to laugh this time. The sight of the drill at the wrong spot was a better joke than anything he could have said. The first day was a grueling exercise in persistence. They went down 40 feet through thick, unyielding clay and found nothing but more heat. At 45 feet, the drill bit came up dry. At 50 feet, then 60, the clay gave way to a hard layer of sandstone, a transitional barrier that Phil called not a good sign, but not a bad one. Earl sat on a fence post nearby, his face as unreadable as a stone, watching the drill move toward the 80-foot mark, the depth where his old well had failed, the depth where everyone in the county believed the story ended. The sun went down, and the heat stayed, trapped against the ground. The drilling stopped for the night, the rig standing like a silent sentinel over a hole that most people believed would stay dry forever. On the morning of the second day, at exactly 62 feet, the sound of the drill changed. It became a wet, grinding crunch. Phil Denton signaled for the rig to stop and pulled the bit. He looked at the cuttings coming up and felt a sudden electric charge of adrenaline. "Gravel," he said, looking at Earl. "Water-bearing gravel. The kind that exists in channels, the kind that connects to something larger below." The skeptics at the fence line leaned in. The atmosphere shifted from pity to an intense, quiet tension. The drill went back down, moving through the gravel with a renewed purpose. At 70 feet, the mud in the baler was cold. At 80 feet, the old limit, the bit kept moving. At 85 feet, the vibrations in the cable became a steady, heavy pulse. Then, at 91 feet, the drill broke through. Tea wasn't a trickle, and it wasn't a seep. It was a breakthrough into a hidden world. Water that had traveled miles through deep gravel, water that had not seen the light of a Kentucky sun in decades, came roaring up. It was cold, the kind of pure, deep cold that means the source is reliable and connected to an ancient regional aquifer that no summer drought could meaningfully touch. Phil Denton had the pump test running within the hour. They let it run for 2 full hours to see if the yield would hold or if it was just a temporary pocket. The numbers on the flow meter didn't drop, they stayed rock steady. 18 gallons per minute. Clear, clean, and fast. It was 1 gallon per minute better than the well Earl's father had found in 1930. Phil Denton pulled off his cap and looked at the numbers in his log, then looked at the old man sitting on the fence post. "You said your father found this in 1930, Phil said, his voice full of the quiet admiration of a craftsman who has just seen a masterpiece. 17 gallons per minute, Earl said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the pump. From 95 feet. He said it would still be here. Earl didn't celebrate. He didn't shout across the fence at the neighbors or wait for Raymond Hollis to drive by so he could gloat. He felt something quieter and more permanent than triumph, the realization that his father had been right about everything that mattered. The knowledge that he had kept alive by walking that fence line every spring for 20 years had been the only bridge between a failed farm and a future. By July 29th, the pump was installed and the irrigation lines were running across the south field. The transformation was visible to anyone driving on Route 9. Within a week, the soybeans began to respond. The curled gray-olive leaves flattened out, their pale color deepening back toward a vibrant, hopeful green, first at the base, then moving up the stems and spreading outward into the canopy. The math was finally complete. The well had cost $870, leaving Earl with $330 in his bank account, enough to cover the fuel for the pump and the basic maintenance to get him to October. The soybeans had 10 weeks to finish, and they were going to finish. The story of the 91-foot miracle moved through Harlan County at the speed of an incoming storm. It was discussed at the co-op, in the grain elevator parking lot, and in the diner where farmers had sat in the same booths for 20 years. They talked about the water yield, but they mostly talked about the man who had walked his fence line for 2 decades, keeping a dead lesson alive until the moment he needed it most. They realized that Earl Cutler hadn't scrambled or spent money on consultants. He had gone to the land with the language his father had taught him to read, and the land had answered. As the harvest approached, Earl stood at the edge of the field, the 18-gallon-per-minute flow of the ancient channel nourishing the earth beneath his boots. He was no longer just a man with a farm. He was the keeper of the 91-foot secret. And as he looked at the green canopy of his soybeans, He knew that the silence from the red truck across the fence line was the loudest acknowledgment of all. By the first week of August 1974, the transformation of the South Field was nothing short of a biblical miracle in the eyes of Harlan County. The 18 gallons per minute of ice-cold water flowing from the 91-foot ghost well had turned the tide of the war. The soybeans, which had been curling into gray olive needles of death, were now a deep, vibrant emerald green, their leaves flat and wide, drinking in the moisture like a parched man at a desert spring. People driving along Route 9 began to pull over, not to laugh, but to stare in total disbelief. The math of Earl's survival was as thin as a razor's edge. After paying the Denton brothers $870 for the drilling, he had exactly $330 left in the bank, just enough to keep the irrigation pumps running and pay for the fuel to see the harvest through. If he had been wrong about his father's 1930 lesson, he would have been a bankrupt man with a dry hole. But as the combine finally moved through the field that October, the numbers spoke the truth. Despite the worst drought in 16 years, Earl's soybeans yielded 37 bushels per acre, well above the county average for that brutal year. He sold at $6.20 per bushel, covered his mortgage, paid his input costs, and put a quiet, modest profit back into the account. The farm had not just survived, it had thrived because a man had trusted a hand-pressed palm against the dirt more than a bank spreadsheet. For the next 9 years, the story of Earl Cutler's well became part of the county's fixed geography. The well produced 18 gallons per minute through the dry summer of 1976 and the grueling drought of 1980, when other farmers were hauling water by truck at ruinous expense. Through it all, the red truck across the fence line stayed silent. Raymond Hollis, with his 400 acres and his deep modern wells, had initially convinced himself that Earl's victory was just a stroke of geological luck, a fluke that any standard survey would have found. But the land has a way of settling scores that no man can predict. In the summer of 1983, the cycle of the earth turned once more, and a new, even more aggressive drought settled over Kentucky. This time, it was Raymond Hollis who felt the ground shrinking beneath his feet. His 3 deep wells, which had seemed like an inexhaustible supply of abundance, began to falter. His north well, drilled to 140 feet, began to drop in pressure. Raymond brought in expensive hydrogeologists from Indianapolis and drilling specialists from Evansville, paying $350 a day for instruments and maps that all delivered the same devastating conclusion. His wells were drawing from a perched water table, a shallow layer isolated from the deep regional aquifer, and he had pumped it dry late August 1983. Raymond's corn was wilting, his yields were dropping by 20%, and the experts told him they could not help him. The surface geology of his 400 acres didn't favor deep water access, they said, and a $14,000 exploratory drilling project came with no guarantees. For 9 years, Raymond had carried the memory of his laughter at the fence line like a heavy stone. He knew every version of Earl's story, including the part about George Cutler and the drought of 1930. A Tuesday morning, the red Chevrolet, now faded and dusty, turned into Earl's Lane. Raymond Hollis climbed out, not with a boot on the bumper, but with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the ground. He walked toward the equipment shed where Earl was working. The confrontation was quiet, stripped of all performance. "Earl," Raymond said, his voice thick with a decade of swallowed pride, "my wells are failing. I've had 5 experts on my property, and not one of them has a path forward. I know what I said at the fence in '74. I've known for a long time I was wrong to say it. I'm asking for your help." Earl Cutler let the words settle in the morning air. He didn't use the moment to gloat, and he didn't ask for an apology. He had been raised by a man who believed that a neighbor in struggle was a problem that belonged to the whole community. "Come inside," Earl said simply. "I'll make some coffee." They sat at the same kitchen table where Earl had calculated his last $1,200 9 years before. Earl didn't give Raymond a map, he gave him a lesson in ancient geometry. He told Raymond to look at the northeastern corner of his own land, a slight 18-inch depression that ran north to south, a feature most people would walk past without a second glance. "My father taught me that surface depressions like that are often the shadows of ancient drainage channels," Earl explained. "They've been dry at the surface for a century, but the deep geology doesn't care. The water still follows that geometry 100 feet down." They drove to the spot that afternoon. Earl didn't use a surveying level or a GPS. He crouched in the dirt, smelled the soil, and finally pressed both palms flat against the ground, holding them there just as his father had shown him in the summer of 1930. He felt the cold wicking up from the deep gravel. He pointed to a spot where the depression curved westward. "Drill here," Earl said. 120 feet. The water is there." The Denton brothers returned, and at 111 feet, they hit a channel that produced 21 gallons per minute, 3 more than Earl's own miracle well. That evening, Raymond Hollis returned to Earl's kitchen, humbled and shaken by the grace he had been shown. "Why did you help me, Earl? After everything?" Earl looked out the window at the land that had sustained 3 generations of his family. "Because the land doesn't keep score, Raymond," Earl said. "It just needs tending. And maybe the lesson about helping a neighbor is worth as much as the one about the water." Earl Cutler farmed for another 17 years, eventually teaching his daughter Margaret how to read the frost patterns in March and how to feel the deep moisture in the soil. When he passed the farm to her in 1991, he didn't just give her a deed, he gave her the language of the ground. To this day, Margaret walks the western fence line every March, keeping her grandfather's 1930 lesson alive. The well still produces, the soybeans still thrive, and the story remains a permanent reminder that some things, like the truth of the earth and the character of a man, never go dry. The year 1991 arrived in Harlan County not with a roar, but with a quiet, rhythmic hum of a pump that had not stopped for 17 years. Earl Cutler was now 78 years old, his body finally beginning to resemble the gnarled cedar posts he had spent a lifetime stretching wire against. His hands, which had once been able to pull a tractor out of a mud wallow by pure leverage, were now thin and translucent, the skin like parchment paper mapped with blue veins. But his eyes remained as sharp and clear as the water at the bottom of a deep limestone well. This was the year the transition became formal. Earl's daughter, Margaret, had been farming beside him since 1983, the year they had saved Raymond Hollis from his own arrogance. She had learned the lessons not from a textbook, but through a decade of early March mornings, walking the western fence line until her boots knew every stone and every shift in the soil's weight. One evening in the spring of 1991, Earl sat her down at the same oak table where he had once counted his last $1,200. He pushed the family deed toward her, but on top of it sat something far more valuable, a small, hand-bound collection of notes and the memory of 1930. "A deed only tells you who owns the surface, Margaret," Earl said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that carried the weight of 80 years of Kentucky history. "But the surface is a liar. It changes with the rain, it changes with the plow, and it changes with the greed of men. If you want to keep this farm, you have to remember what the surface cannot show you." For Margaret, taking over the 63 acres in the 1990s meant facing a world that was moving at a speed her father and grandfather would have found exhausting. The agricultural colleges were pushing GPS mapping, satellite soil analysis, and hydrosurveys that promised to find water with the push of a button. To the young experts, who occasionally stopped by to sell her new irrigation systems, Margaret was a curiosity, a woman running a mid-sized operation with techniques that seemed like folklore. They didn't understand the March ritual. Every year, before the first sprout of the season appeared, Margaret would walk the bend in the old dry creek bed. She wasn't looking for weeds or checking the fence wire. She was looking for the frost. Just as George Cutler had shown Earl in 1930, Margaret knew that where the frost lingered the longest in the morning sun, the cold from the deep underground channel was nearest the surface. She was reading the ancient geometry of a stream that had been moving beneath their boots since long before the county was even a line on a map, and the late 1990s, a new generation of surveyors arrived in Harlan County, representing a regional water conglomerate that wanted to buy the rights to the deep aquifer Margaret's well tapped into. They came with truck-mounted sensors and topographical maps that looked like works of art. They spent 3 days on the property, and when they sat in her kitchen, they told her exactly what the experts had told Raymond Hollis in 1983. "The regional water table is fragmented here. Our maps don't show a consistent flow through this sector. You're lucky to have that 91-foot well, but it's likely an isolated pocket that will eventually deplete." Margaret had smiled, a slow, patient smile she had inherited from her father. She didn't show them the maps. She took them to the fence line. She crouched down and pressed her palms flat against the earth, holding them there for nearly 2 minutes in absolute silence. "Your maps record what your instruments detected at a particular time," Margaret told them, echoing the words Earl had used to humble Raymond Hollis years before. "But the ground holds what has been true for 1,000 years. It will tell you the truth if you know how to listen to it. There is no instrument that does what this does, and there never will be." The surveyors had left, confused and empty-handed. They couldn't quantify a feeling, and they couldn't put a price on the geometry of the deep. But the results spoke for themselves. While neighboring farms occasionally struggled with pressure loss or mineral contamination, the 91-foot miracle well continued to yield 18 gallons per minute, cold and fast and strong. The final victory of the Cutler family wasn't just about the water, though. It was about the reconciliation of the land. Raymond Hollis, until the day he passed away, remained one of Margaret's closest advisers. The man who had once laughed at Earl's dry well became the primary advocate for Cutler knowledge in the county seat. The two families, once divided by a fire-engine red truck and a sense of superiority, became a single unit of land-tending wisdom. When Earl passed away quietly in the winter of 1995, he didn't leave behind a massive fortune. He left a legacy of attention. He proved that the men who survive the dry years are not the ones with the most money or the biggest equipment, but the ones who understood the land before the drought ever started. He left a daughter who knew that water doesn't disappear. It just goes somewhere else. Today, if you drive down Route 9 in the heat of a Kentucky July, you can still see the Roe Cutler bottomland. You might see a woman walking the fence line, stopping at a particular bend in an old dry creek bed to press her hands into the soil. She isn't searching for something new. She is verifying what has always been there. She is proving that some things, like the character of a neighbor and the truth of the earth, never go dry. The story of the 91-foot miracle remains a permanent reminder to the people of Harlan County. It tells them that when the crisis comes, it is already too late to start learning. The knowledge has to already be inside you. And in a world that is always rushing to look at the next map, the Cutlers remain the keepers of the ground, waiting for the rest of us to remember how to listen.